All right, we're now moving into week 3, part 3 of the lecture. And here I want to talk about access to voting, access to the ballot. And then finally, we're going to end up with a quick summary of the different ways that you'll be able to vote in the upcoming election. The dates to apply for many of these things are coming up quickly. I have applied already to get a mail-in ballot because of COVID-19. I don't really have a great desire to stand in line at the polling place on election day. And I know, I don't remember the exact date, but it was early in October was the date by which you had to have your request into the local board of canvassers in Rhode Island, or you would not be able to vote by mail in the state. So the deadlines for applying for the different types of voting are coming up quickly. And if you don't want to stand in line on election day to cast your vote, you need to get online, make yourself aware of what's going on, and we'll talk about that a little bit, how you do that as we get to the end of this. Access to the ballot. A number of issues have been rolling around in the public's attention and the media's attention in the last 15, 20 years that have to do with accessing the ballot and letting people get to vote. Basically, at this point in time, it is possible for almost anyone to register to vote. The laws have been put in place to make sure that that can happen. Any of the old discriminatory laws based on race, religion, creed, sex have been pretty much done away with on both state and local levels at this point. So the issue has now moved from registering people to vote to making sure that all registered voters are somehow able to vote when it comes time to do that. And some of the things that have been argued about vehemently are basically fall into the idea, something that we call voter suppression, or that people call voter suppression, that even though you have voters who are registered, we do different things to make it difficult or impossible for them to vote so that their votes end up not being cast. And certainly if the political parties are doing this, the thought is that they are doing it with the idea that we will suppress the voters from the other party, and if they just don't show up to vote or prevent it from voting, that will help us because we'll have more folks from our side actually casting their ballots. One of the most hotly contested things, although something that is still very prevalent and doesn't appear will be going away, is something called voter ID. Voter ID is a requirement that when you go to vote, you have to produce a photographic ID showing who you are and establishing that you are the person you claim to be, that you are the registered voter, and until you do that, you would not be allowed to actually vote. Now, this is a fairly recent thing, even though driver's licenses with your picture on them have been around for 50, 60 years at least now, some states even longer. Passports with your picture on them have been around since the turn of the last century. The idea of having to show a photo ID, it was a kind of a novel thing that kind of appeared 30-some years ago and began to grow and take hold. And one of the reasons for this is that, again, we said earlier in this week's lectures that the basic structure of voting was left by the Constitution to the states, and even within the states it was left very much to the local authorities, municipal authorities or county authorities, so that you have the voting apparatus, which is either the Board of Canvassers or the Board of Elections, election officials. They tend to be local entities, and particularly prior to the 20th century, most people voted in person at polling stations very close to their house, and they were known by the people who were running the election. So it was known who was a citizen and who was not a citizen. It was known who lived in the area and who didn't. So it'd be very difficult for somebody who was not registered, who was not from that area, to come in and cast a fraudulent ballot. Now, as the cities began to grow and as things became more impersonal, but prior to the age of computers, they came up with a system that was used in most places across the country where, in order to vote, you had to show up prior to the election. There were deadlines set, and usually they were 60 or 90 days out. You had to show up at your Board of Canvassers or election official's office, and you had to fill out a form. And you had to establish, number one, that you were a citizen. Number two, that you were a resident in the district where you were registering to vote, and you had to give your address and contact information. And then finally, you had to sign a voter registration card. These cards were actually organized and brought to the polling places on each election day. And as you went in to vote, you had to sign a ballot piece of paper to get your actual ballot that you marked. And before you were given a ballot to mark and to drop into the box, you had to sign, and your signature was compared by the officials running the polling place to see that you were the same person who actually filed the registration to vote. This system went along for quite a while, but then again, beginning about 30 years ago, they began this idea that people are fraudulently voting, that people can forge signatures, and therefore we need a better system. And a number of states began to adopt the requirement that you had to have a photo ID to vote. Now, this has been vehemently contested, particularly by liberals, on the basis of that many poor people do not have picture IDs, or they don't have picture IDs that would qualify them to vote, and that therefore you are suppressing the votes of the poor, you are suppressing the votes of people who would generally be more liberal and probably pro-Democrat, not pro-Republican. And so therefore you are affecting the elections. You are suppressing the vote by requiring people to have a photo ID. That argument comes up every 4 years, every 2 years. It'll probably be up again in the next few weeks. You will hear it. To a certain extent, that has been refuted. And a number of states, Rhode Island among them, have taken great steps to make sure that nobody lacks a valid ID. Some of the requirements, just to take Rhode Island as an example, for valid voter IDs, you can use a Rhode Island driver's license or a permit to drive. You can use a U.S. passport. You can use any identification card issued by any federally recognized tribal government. So if you are a member of any of the Indian nations and you have an ID card that shows you to be such, that is the equivalent of a state driver's license or a passport. You can use any ID card issued by an institution, an educational institution in the United States. So your college ID would allow you to show who you are to vote. A U.S. military ID card, an ID card issued by the U.S. government or the state of Rhode Island. If you had a RIPTA bus pass with the picture, I suppose it would fall into this. Rhode Island also has a program where if you do not have a driver's license, you can still go to the registry and apply for a Rhode Island ID. And again, if you can present the proper paperwork to show that you are who you are, they will issue you a picture ID from the state of Rhode Island, say that you are who you are. And this would certainly qualify you to vote. And then the other thing is Rhode Island has now set up a system where when you register to vote, in order to verify who you are and where you live, they send out certain information to you after the polls. And part of this is a voter ID card. I do not believe that in most cities and towns who still control this process in Rhode Island that these are picture cards. But according to the Rhode Island regulations, it says your voter ID card that you obtained once you were registered to vote, which they sent to your house as proof that you are who you are by getting the mail at that address, that card, even without a picture, would be sufficient to be your identification. If you show up at the polls without a photo ID or without your voter ID card, you can cast a provisional ballot. And a provisional ballot means that you're allowed to vote, particularly in the federal elections, but that ballot is held aside, and that within a certain number of hours or a couple of days after the election, you must arrive at the voting official's office, the Board of Canvassers' office in your town, and show them something, whatever they're requiring to establish your identification. And if you do that, then your ballot is put in with the other ballots and counted. If you're not, your ballot is destroyed. Looking at this list, and I am certainly not one to say that anybody should be prevented from voting But knowing human nature, I'm also very, very cynical about the idea that elections will always be fair and above board, and there'll never be any cheating, there'll never be any fraud. One of the things that I say when I'm looking at this list is, at this point in time, in the technological society that we live in, what percentage of people do not have this type of identification? To me, it would seem to be, and particularly in this part of the country, it would have to be very small, because it doesn't matter what you're involved in. You need photo IDs. You need pictures. Sometimes when I'm going for medical services now, I have my Blue Cross card, which does not have a picture on it, but the doctor's office or the people who are running the procedure or the clinic, they have a camera and they take my picture and put it in their file to be able to prove to Blue Cross that the person who showed up with the card was me. So in this day and age where the technology exists to easily create these things for very little money or very often for free, I really question the arguments of the people who say that this suppresses voting in any meaningful way. If you don't have identification in this society, particularly if you live in an urban area, you basically are a non-person. There's almost nothing that you can do. So it just surprises me that this is as contentious an issue as it has been and continues to be by and large. Statistics about who are disqualified by voter ID requirements are all over the board. They range from a low of in Iowa, less than 2% of the people lack the proper ID, to a couple of studies that said as many as 25% of people in majority areas, particularly in poor areas, lack the proper ID. And looking at the various data that's out there, it seemed very difficult to put a clear number on how many people lack the requisite ID to vote. Another issue that has come up is the idea of non-citizen voting. Now, generally throughout history, although again the Constitution didn't say it, most states required that you had to be a citizen, a resident of that state in order to vote. You became a citizen either by nature of your birth in the United States and United States territory, or by the naturalization process of moving here as an immigrant and then going through the process to become a citizen. A number of people have begun to question that, saying, is that fair when we have such a large non-citizen and non-documented population, that we prevent these people from voting, from determining the issues that affect their lives? In 1995, Congress passed and the President signed a law making it illegal for non-citizens to vote for federal offices. So the states have to do some kind of provision to show that you're a citizen in order for you to qualify to vote for your state representatives, senators, and for the president. In recent times, the city of San Francisco, a number of cities surrounding Washington and suburban Maryland have passed regulations allowing non-citizens to vote in their local elections, but local elections only. So far as I know, no state has allowed that yet, but it is an up-and-coming issue. There are estimates that there are anywhere between 10 and 30 million unregistered people living in this country, and that does not count the number of people who come in as registered immigrants that are given full-time resident status here but are not yet citizens and therefore not be eligible to vote. So we could be talking upwards of 40 million people that would fall under this category. So it is something that probably will not go away, will continue to be bounced around. Voter registration, how it's conducted, who can do it, has been a hot topic. And again, although it is fairly easy to register to vote today, there's still many people who claim that there are too many restrictions, too many hoops to jump through, it's too difficult, and that itself works to suppress the vote by keeping people from bothering with registering. In most jurisdictions, prior to 1993, to register to vote, you had to, as we talked about earlier, appear at the local board of canvassers or board of elections. You had to prove your citizenship, you had to prove your residency, you had to prove your age, and you had to fill out a form and you had to give your signature. The rules varied from state to state as to exactly what these requirements are. Also, the rules vary dramatically, sometimes even within a state, from town to town, as to how long before the election did you have to do this to still be eligible to vote in the upcoming election. And those rules went anywhere from a year down to a day or two, down to the same day. And they were all over the board and they were crazy. And many people who deal with voting and election issues complained that the rules were so complicated that they by themselves prevented a number of people from registering to vote because they didn't know the deadlines, they didn't know the dates, so they would miss them and become discouraged and not try again for the next election. They also complain about the idea that in order to vote under this system, you would need a birth certificate, you'd need naturalization papers, you'd need proof of residency, and that, again, many poorer people do not have those items readily available, do not have the money or the wherewithal to get them easily, and that would prevent them from voting because they couldn't meet all of the paperwork requirements. In 1993, Congress passed a law, and it's called the Motor Voter Act, which has affectionately come to be known as the Voter Bill or the Motor Voter Bill, which said that in order to receive federal money, all departments of motor vehicles in the states that dealt with licensing of people had to make available the documentation that would allow someone to register to vote and would have to pass those registration forms on to the local canvassing offices. So basically allowing you to register to vote when you went to renew your driver's license or to obtain a driver's license for the first time. There have been lots of complaints about these laws. There have been people who vehemently want to uphold these laws. The basic complaint is that a lot of people are not eligible to vote, end up filling out the cards, sending them in, and then their names appear on the voting list the next election. The people who favor these say that it streamlines the process and it allows people to do it without a special trip to their town or city hall to get this done. In Rhode Island, to register to vote, the requirements are that you must be a citizen of the United States, you must be a resident of the state of Rhode Island, you can register as early as age 16 but cannot actually vote until you turn 18, and you can register online, by mail, or in person, or again through the registry system in Rhode Island. You can register the same day to vote for president, but can only vote for president on that day. If you have been adjudicated incompetent, or if you are presently serving a prison sentence for a felony, then you are not allowed to vote. Now, interestingly, there's been a big discussion lately about restoring voting rights to convicted persons. And in many states, the law is that once you've been convicted of a felony, you have lost your right to vote, and without a special act by the legislature or without a clemency bill from the governor, you will never regain your right to vote. Some states have modified that by saying if you go 4 or 5 years after your prison sentence is done and you have not recommitted an offense, then you get registered to vote. In Rhode Island, the restriction is now limited to that if you're actually serving prison time, you cannot vote from prison. But other than that, your rights to vote are not affected. Gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the rearranging of voting district boundaries to favor one group or one political party over another. The term comes from an 1812 political dispute in Massachusetts where Governor Elbridge Gerry was trying to rearrange the voting districts, and this is usually done every 10 years. We have a census every 10 years. There's one going on right now. It's specifically called for in the main body of the Constitution because the number of representatives each state has to Congress is dependent on population. And even at the beginning, they realized that population was growing and moving and changing. So they mandated constitutionally that every year the federal government must count the number of people in the country, and that based on those counts, the seats the House of Representatives will be allocated. In the early years, they would keep increasing the number of representatives, but they realized that it would become totally unwieldy to have 2 or 3 or 4,000 representatives trying to meet and do something. So in the 1940s, they capped the number of representatives, and now the game becomes one of rearranging which states have more or less representatives every 10 years based upon the census. And so, based upon the census, voting districts are also rearranged. There is case law that goes back quite far that says that the voting districts are supposed to be roughly equal so that you don't end up with, and if you go just by town lines or county lines, sometimes that does not happen. So that the voting districts have to be created in such a way, like in Rhode Island, we have 2 representatives to Congress. Every 10 years, the districts have shifted a little bit based on how people have moved to make sure there are approximately 500,000 people in each district. It does not have to be numerically exact, but the courts have said it has to be reasonably equal for it to be valid. So there's lots of room to fiddle with these things. We are still very much a segregated society socially in terms of wealth. You have poor neighborhoods, middle-class neighborhoods, working neighborhoods, upper middle-class neighborhoods, wealthy neighborhoods. These groups tend to vote in different ways and for different parties. And so by removing district lines, you take a solidly Democratic district, cut it in half, and add each piece to solidly Republican districts, you might end up in a situation where normally a Democrat would be guaranteed to win almost every election. Now they're going to have to fight their Republican counterparts in order to be elected and may often lose to that. So it is a very hotly contested thing. And the term gerrymandering came about from the idea that Governor Gerry tried to create, and if you look in the notes, I have a picture that came from an editorial in a newspaper in 1812, tried to create a district made up of towns that really weren't touching each other. And when you drew the towns, it looked like some kind of a mythical beast with a head and a neck and a body. And somebody made the smart aleck remark that that was looked like a salamander, to which another person made the remark, and this was all done in the newspapers and editorial columns and letters to the editor, that no, it's not a salamander, it's a gerrymander, using Governor Gerry's last name. And for poor Governor Gerry, that became a common political word in Massachusetts to describe this idea of trying to fudge the district so that your party can win. And it was such a funny thing in those days, it was picked up and quickly became the term across the country. So gerrymandering is the idea that we move the districts, we rearrange the lines to help one party or the other. Now, in Miller versus Johnson in 1995, the Supreme Court made it very clear that under the 14th and 15th Amendment, you cannot do this for racial purposes, so that you are depriving one race or ethnic group or religious group of the right to vote by moving the district lines. Short of that, however, the court has come up with, they have indicated in dicta, in some of their opinions, concurring opinions, dissenting opinions, that they don't like this process, but they have been unable to come up with a rule to apply. And they've gone back and forth in cases as to whether this type of districting for other political reasons, not racial, ethnic reasons, is legal. And basically, in the most recent case, which came down in 2019, they ruled that as long as it's not violating the anti-racial desegregation provisions of the Constitution, that these cases are political cases. They're left better to the president and to the Congress and the state representatives and governors to decide when the moving of these lines is proper and is not proper, and basically indicated that the court doesn't want to be involved in handling this at this point in time. We've already talked a little bit about voter suppression, the idea that, people in political power will do things to try and keep certain voters or groups of voters from registering, from going to the polls. This is going to come up big time. It came up big time in 2016 and again in 2018. There is a woman who ran for governor of Georgia, whose name I forget at the moment, who lost by a solid 60,000 votes, who has still been roaming around the country stating that she is the true governor of Georgia because a number, hundreds of thousands of people that wanted to vote for her were suppressed in one way or another and couldn't vote. So I have no doubt, regardless of which way the pending election comes out, one side or the other is going to be making this argument. Some examples beyond what we've talked about here of voter suppression have to do with limited number of voting places, limited number of voting machines or computers, limited hours when they're open on election day, limited hours or days to do early voting, overly strict interpretation of voter ID rules, overly strict proof of residency requirements, confusing rules for the deadline as to when you can apply to register or when you can apply for a mail ballot, making mail-in ballots overly complicated by requiring witnesses or notarization, and signatures of the voter, automatic purging of voter rolls if you haven't voted in a certain number of elections or a certain number of years, purging of voting rolls if you don't respond to mail inquiries made by the voting officials. These are all given as examples of things that voting officials do, of different ways that they try and keep on top of what they're doing, but that a number of people, particularly civil rights activists, say they actually limit the number of people that can vote and they take the franchise away from people who are otherwise eligible for it. Under the Voting Rights Act of 1964-65, Congress had passed a provision in this law that basically said that any state that was found to have been playing games with its voting rules for racial reasons would come under control of the federal government, and that before they could amend their voting laws or rules, they would have to file the proposed amendments with the Attorney General of the United States, who would then review them to determine if they were racially neutral or not, and if they were not, the Attorney General of the state could veto effectively and could deny the state from imposing those new voting rules. In 2013, the Supreme Court threw out this, saying that those rules were needed 50 years ago, but not today. The time for imposing them had passed, and that they should leave it up to the states to decide who can vote and who cannot. And certainly since that time, a large number of states have begun to tighten their voting requirements to make it more difficult to register to vote. Okay. Quick review now to hopefully help you coming up in the next election of ways to vote. Already garnering great controversy this year is the idea of a mail-in ballot. A mail-in ballot is something you must apply for in advance of the election. The election officials send you a ballot that you fill out at home, put in a pre-set-up envelope, and you must sign it. Usually you sign the envelope, not the ballot, so your ballot, once it's thrown into the mess, will actually be secret. In some states, this must be notarized, making it means for most people they have to go out of their house and find a notary to notarize their signature. The ballot has to be sent back and has to be received by a certain deadline, and then it will be added to the rest of the votes if you do that. A large number of people have called for expanded or universal voting by mail due to COVID-19 issues. This presents all kinds of problems, as the president has been tweeting about almost incessantly for the last few weeks, in that the mail is just hideous at times. Ballots, the request for your ballot can be lost, the ballot being sent to you can be lost, the ballot being sent back by you could be lost. There was one of the polling groups did a survey recently just to try and see how good the mails are, and I forget, they were in some big city. They sent out 1,500 or 2,000 sample surveys, and they got a certain percentage back. And it was a very low percentage. If I remember correctly, it was somewhere in the 70s that they got back. And they had kept track of who they had sent these to. So after they had sent them out, they contacted these people by phone or email and said, gee, why didn't you send the ballot back? It's some incredible number, like 13 or 14% of them said, we never even got it. And these were all sent postage prepaid first class mail, basically indicating that something close to 15% of the U.S. mail is not getting delivered, at least in that city, on any particular day. Now, if that's the reality, and you have to, first of all, mail in your request for a ballot, then the ballot has to be mailed back to you, and then you have to mail the ballot back to the Board of Canvassers. You're talking about a 45% possibility that your ballot never makes it to the box of votes that are being counted on election day. That being the reality, there's a certain amount of, there's a kernel of truth in what the president is complaining about here, that the mail ballots, and certainly universal mail voting, could become totally chaotic. The other reality about mail-in voting is that many states have provisions where mail-in voting and absentee ballots, which we're going to talk about, which are a little bit different, are counted separately because they have to be counted by hand. Usually they're not in a form that can be run through the machines. And in many states, that process does not even begin until the polls close on election day, that people have right up until the moment the polls close to get these paper ballots into the Board of Elections, and they only begin counting these votes the morning after the actual election day. In a country and a society where over the last 75 or 80 years, we have become accustomed to knowing that night or knowing first thing the next morning who won the election, if millions upon millions of additional mail ballots are dumped into the system at this point in time, we run the risk of running into a scenario where it's going to take state and local officials days upon days, if not weeks, to count and tabulate all these so that, again, as in 2000, we may not have any idea who has won the presidency or other offices until weeks after the actual election day. And in light of the present chaos that seems to be going on in certain parts of the country, somehow I can't believe that is going to make things better. Some states actually say that as long as the mail-in ballot is postmarked on the date of the election, it is valid, which, dear God, again, looking at the way the post office operates, that means that things could be coming in days and weeks after the election and still have to be counted as valid votes. This type of chaos, it wasn't with mail-in votes, but this type of voting chaos was what really became the issue in the 2000 election with George Bush versus Al Gore. Florida, in many counties, had voting systems that were challenged for being inaccurate, and recounts were demanded in many counties. One particular system that some of the bigger counties, like Miami, used in Florida, whatever county, I think it's Broward County that Miami is in, involved something called a punch card. Now, you folks in the digital age probably don't know what a punch card is, but for many years, there were mechanical systems, and even the early computers were fed data by, it was a cardboard, a thin cardboard card, and you would punch holes in it, and the computer would either mechanically or through light read those holes, and that was how you would input data. Well, the state of Florida was using some kind of bizarre punch card system where the voter was given a punch card, they would stick it into a framework that had the different candidates' names on it and positions they were running for, and they were given a metal stylus to poke holes in the card. Then the card could be run through a machine that would read the holes in the card. Well, you can imagine the disaster that this can be when you have a closely contested election. People punched holes in places where there weren't supposed to be holes. People just made a little dimple in the card and didn't actually punch a hole through that the light could come through so the machine could read it. People didn't align the card correctly in the thing when they went to vote, so the holes were all in the wrong places. So there were weeks, and in some of the states, in some of the counties in Florida, they actually had, the holes had been pre-punched, so that there was a little tiny rectangle of cardboard called a chad, and by sticking your stylus through the framework, you were supposed to punch out the chad, and it was supposed to fall away, and that would leave a nice, clear, rectangular hole, symmetrical hole for the light reader to read. Well, Many of the cards you tried to punch through and get the Chad to come off, and it didn't come off. And so quickly it became known as the election of the hanging Chads. And for weeks we had people from the boards of elections sitting there going through millions of votes, looking at the little punch holes, trying to determine were the holes there, were they not there, was that dimple meant to be a hole? Oh, here's a Chad that's somewhat detached but not totally detached. Was that a vote or was that not a vote? And this showed no sign of ending any time before January 20th. And so the court got involved, and as I had said earlier, the Secretary of State of Florida at some point had ratified the votes that had come in and said that George Bush was the winner. And the Supreme Court basically hung their hat on that and said the Secretary of State's certification wins the day. All recounting must stop at this point because once the Secretary of State certified the election, it was final. According to one tabulation, and there have been many, you can find statistics all over the board on this, but on one tabulation, Bush won Florida by only 537 votes out of a total of nearly 6 million passed. So that is an infinitesimally small percentage, and it is certainly within any margin of error in terms of counting the votes. So it was that close in Florida. Another way you can vote is to vote early. Rhode Island has adopted this system in the last few elections. You can go to your local Board of Elections or Board of Canvassers and request a ballot that you fill out at that point in time. They put it in an envelope and seal it. You hand it right back in, and then that ballot is in the ballots that are counted on the election day itself. Again, there are requirements for when you can do this. You cannot do it on election day, and you cannot do it very close to election day. So if that is something that you'd be interested in doing, you need now to call your local Board of Canvassers and find out the process and exactly what dates and times you can go in to do that. Now, you certainly can vote in person at your designated polling place on election day. As we said, a number of issues have arisen over the years and tend to arise every year when voting places are changed without notice to the voters, where hours are shortened, where voting machines don't work, or paper ballots are missing so that you can't vote, or that they're incorrect with the wrong names or wrong people on them to vote for. Sometimes there have been insufficient machines or voting stations for the number of people that are supposed to vote, and then the lines become hours long. They fill the building, wrap around the block, which is why many people don't want to attempt to vote in person. This is a very hotly contested election coming up. In all likelihood, large numbers of people will show up. Normally, rarely do 50% of the registered voters show up, and the system is really only equipped to deal with a small number of voters, so that if everybody who is registered to vote shows up, it becomes a disaster very quickly. And many of us older folks don't want to stand in line for hours breathing in everybody else's COVID-19 virus while we're waiting to do that. Many voters have complained that computers don't always work correctly, do not let them vote for who they want to, or that after they've made a vote and they go on to look at some of the other candidates, come back and the computer has changed their vote, their first vote to a different candidate. There have been all kinds of complaints about computer voting in the last few elections. And again, I'm sure these are all going to come up and be present with us again. An absentee ballot is something which you have to apply for, and it is given to you by your local Board of Canvassers, and it was basically designed originally for people who were shut-ins, who were physically unable to get out to the polls. I know 2 years ago I was sick in the hospital on election day, and my daughter and one of our friends went and obtained an absentee ballot for me from the Board of Canvassers. The third party picks it up, brings it to the person who can't get to the polls. The person fills it out, signs it, completes it, seals it, and then gives it to the third person who hand carries it back to the Board of Elections so it can be counted. There have been great controversies about absentee ballots over the years because different political operatives have endeavored at times to go and apply for absentee ballots for, say, the entire population of a nursing home or housing for the elderly. carry those ballots to these folks and will help them, which normally in political terms means trying to persuade them who to vote for, and then of course happily collecting all the ballots and carrying them back. So there have been complaints about absentee balloting over the years as well. And again, I'm sure we're going to see them as we roll into the next election. Now, post-election issues. Ballot validation. In many states, as a matter of fact, I say probably most states, mail-in ballots and absentee ballots are subject to a process where they are reviewed one by the Board of Canvassers or the election officials to make sure that they are correctly filled out and correctly processed. A ballot with missing information or technical errors can be rejected and not counted. How much error there has to be, exactly what technical errors would throw a ballot out, become hotly contested things. They've been the issue of many local and state court cases. And again, in a very close election, they become critical. Recounts. In most states, a candidate is entitled to a recount of the votes to determine the correctness of the final count. This, of course, cannot, by definition, be done election day. It is done at some later time. In many states, if the outcome is very close, a recount is required by law. And recounts can take a great deal of time. They are very costly for the districts that have to conduct them. And very often the state laws say that recounts have to be done in a physical manner where people are actually looking at the ballots, physically counting the ballots, so that the recounts tend to be a much more labor-intensive and time-consuming process than actual election day is. And again, this can result in the election results being delayed for days and days or weeks and weeks. Certification of election results. In most states, the local election returns, which are collected, are usually only official after the Secretary of State or some other high state official reviews them and certifies that the results are accurate. In Bush v. Gore, this became an issue of great contest and controversy. Florida law required the Secretary of State to certify the results within a certain period of time. A number of large counties were still doing recounts and still trying to figure out what the chads meant. When this date came, the Secretary of State went ahead and certified the results that had already been sent to her office, thus making the recount process void after that, although when people brought this to the Florida courts, including up to the Supreme Court, reopened the counting and said, nope, Secretary of State certification doesn't apply in our eyes. This was particularly problematic because most of the counties where the recounts were going on were Democratic counties. The Secretary of State was a Republican. And her certification pronounced George Bush the winner of Florida, but because of the Electoral College votes, that also made him the President of the United States. So needless to say, her word was not accepted without argument, and of course it got to the United States Supreme Court, which basically shut down in a political question, which they supposedly don't deal with, shut down the election process, shut down the recount process, and made Bush the President of the United States. Legal scholars have been arguing ever since, why did the Supreme Court do that? I really feel, in my own estimation, we were already in mid-December. The recount process showed no sign of abating. There were challenges going on in several of the state courts, several of the Florida federal district courts, all of which would take time to work their way through the system, would require an answer, and it was looking more and more like we could get to January 20th and not know how many electoral votes were supposed to be cast for either side and not know who the president would be. And part of my cynical self says the judges of the Supreme Court just said, not on our watch. We have gone through 200 years of successful elections, going through the peaceful transfer of process. After our elections, we're not about, at this juncture, to have an election where nobody knows who became president. Not legal, doesn't follow constitutional theory, but certainly a pragmatic result that people in, again, legal circles, constitutional law circles, historian circles are still vehemently arguing about to this day. And in certain respects, the tremendous contentiousness between the Republicans and the Democrats, which grew up under Bill Clinton. Remember, President Clinton was impeached, and we'll talk about that next week. So there was certainly no love for him among the Republicans. But then, coming on the heels of President Clinton, the election basically being given to the Republican candidate by the Supreme Court, and in view of the fact that it came out that the popular vote actually went in favor of Al Gore, began to create the animosity that we see today between the political parties and the rancor that we see between them, and that has only grown over time. It certainly became more pronounced in the Clinton-Trump election, where again, Trump won the electoral vote, but Clinton won the popular vote. And a lot of what is going on right now is really recriminations for these things that have happened in the past. And a lot of it, when you listen to these folks and you wonder where are they coming from, a lot of it doesn't even have to do with present reality. It has to do with our getting our turn based on our being unjustly or unfairly locked out of things at times in the past. Not the best way to run a system, not the best way to run an election. We will see over the next month and a half how all this will unravel. All right, that is it for week 3. I will now be moving on to do the lecture for week 4. Over and out.